He threw out his wife with their newborn twins into the freezing December night, blood still seeping through her hospital gown from the emergency C-section just 4 days earlier. Nathaniel Ashford stood in the marble doorway of their Beacon Hill estate, his arm wrapped around his secretary-turned-mistress, both of them laughing as Amelia stumbled down the icy steps clutching her babies like they were the only things keeping her tethered to earth. What Nathaniel didn't know, what his arrogance had blinded him to completely, was that the woman he'd just discarded like yesterday's newspaper was about to become his worst nightmare. Because in exactly 48 hours, a convoy of black Bentleys would roll up that same driveway, and Amelia's father would step out to reclaim not just his daughter's dignity, but everything Nathaniel thought he owned. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. The wind cut through Amelia's thin hospital discharge clothes like razors as she stood on the sidewalk, her bare feet already numb against the concrete. Behind her, the mansion glowed with warm golden light, the same mansion where she'd spent 3 years playing the perfect wife, hosting dinner parties for Nathaniel's business associates, smiling graciously while he took credit for every successful evening she'd orchestrated down to the last detail. Now that same house felt like a fortress she'd been banished from, its windows mocking her with their warmth. "Please," she'd whispered to him just moments before, her voice barely audible over the twins crying. "Just until morning. They're only 4 days old, Nathaniel. Look at them, they need shelter." But her husband's face had been carved from stone, his blue eyes empty of everything she'd once believed she'd seen there. Love, respect, basic human decency. Had any of it ever been real? "You heard me, Amelia," he'd said, his voice flat and mechanical. "You're no longer welcome here. Take your bastards and go." The word bastards had hit her like a physical blow. These were his children, children he'd claimed to want, children whose ultrasound photos he'd once carried in his wallet, children he'd promised to protect and cherish. Now he called them bastards because their existence had become inconvenient to his new life. Behind him, Scarlett Davidson had appeared like a vulture drawn to carnage. Nathaniel's executive assistant, the woman who'd been scheduling their late-night meetings and business dinners for the past 8 months. She wore Amelia's silk robe, the emerald green one Nathaniel had given her last Christmas, and her smile was slow and satisfied, like she'd won a prize she'd been plotting to steal for years. "This is so awkward," Scarlett had purred, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Maybe you should have tried harder to keep your husband interested." Her hand had rested possessively on Nathaniel's chest, her diamond engagement ring, Amelia's grandmother's ring that had mysteriously disappeared from her jewelry box 2 months ago, catching the light. Amelia had wanted to scream, to claw at Scarlett's perfect face, to demand answers for the 6 years of her life she'd poured into this marriage. But her body was still healing from major surgery, her stitches pulling with every breath, and her arms were occupied with keeping her newborn daughters alive. Survival had to come before justice. "I gave you everything," Amelia had whispered, her voice cracking. 6 years. Nathaniel. 6 years of building your career, supporting your dreams, making your house a home. How can you do this? Nathaniel had stepped forward then, his face twisted with contempt that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ugly inside him. "You gave me what? A wife who couldn't even manage a simple dinner party without embarrassing me? A wife whose family brought nothing to the table? You were charity, Amelia. I married you because I felt sorry for you, and now I'm tired of pretending." The words had landed like physical blows, each one designed to strip away another piece of her self-worth. Standing there in the December cold, holding her babies while her husband and his mistress dismissed her like garbage, Amelia felt something inside her break. But underneath the humiliation and pain, something harder was beginning to form. Something patient and calculating and absolutely ruthless. Because what Nathaniel didn't know, what he'd been too arrogant and self-absorbed to ever discover, was that Amelia's worthless family had been carefully managing one of the largest private fortunes in North America for 3 generations. Her father, Jonathan Winters, wasn't the simple college professor Nathaniel believed him to be. He was the CEO of Winters Global Holdings, a man who controlled shipping lanes, tech companies, and real estate empires across 4 continents. A man who'd spent his daughter's entire marriage quietly investigating her husband, documenting every lie, every affair, every dollar stolen from accounts Nathaniel didn't even know existed. A man who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. As Amelia turned and walked away from the mansion, her bare feet leaving bloody prints on the frozen sidewalk, she pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. The screen showed 17 missed calls, all from the same number. A number she hadn't seen in 2 years, since her father had tried one last time to warn her about Nathaniel before their wedding. A warning she'd ignored because she'd been too in love, too naive, too desperate to believe in the fairy tale. Now, standing under a broken streetlight with her daughters crying against her chest, Amelia finally understood that fairy tales were for children. Real life required strategy, patience, and the kind of power that came from being underestimated by exactly the right people at exactly the right time. She dialed her father's number. He answered on the first ring. "Hello, sweetheart," Jonathan Winters said, his voice warm and steady and absolutely lethal. "I've been waiting for your call." The phone trembled in Amelia's frozen fingers as her father's voice cut through the December wind like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She hadn't spoken to Jonathan Winters in 2 years, not since their explosive argument about Nathaniel, not since she'd chosen her husband's promises over her father's warnings, not since she'd walked away from everything she'd grown up with to prove that love could conquer the doubts of a man who'd built his fortune by trusting no one. "Dad!" The word came out broken, barely a whisper above the twins' cries. She was standing under a flickering streetlight 3 blocks from the mansion, her hospital gown soaked through, her bare feet bleeding on the sidewalk. Behind her, she could still see the warm glow of windows that no longer welcomed her, could still hear the echo of Scarlett's laughter as the door had slammed shut. "Where are you right now?" Jonathan's voice was calm, controlled, but Amelia could hear something underneath it. Something that reminded her of the storms that used to roll across Lake Superior when she was a child, deceptively quiet before they unleashed their full fury. Amelia looked around, disoriented. Street signs blurred through her tears. "I'm on Marlborough Street. Dad, he threw us out. Nathaniel threw me and the babies out in the middle of the night. I have nowhere to go. I don't have any money. I don't even have shoes." "You have everything you need," Jonathan said, and there was something in his tone that made Amelia stop walking. "You just don't know it yet. Listen to me very carefully, sweetheart. Are you listening?" One of the twins, little Grace, chose that moment to let out a wail that echoed off the brownstone buildings. Amelia shifted both babies, trying to shelter them from the wind with her body. "I'm listening. 3 blocks north of where you're standing, there's a hotel called the Commonwealth. The penthouse suite is registered under the name A. Winters. The concierge is expecting you. Go there now. Don't ask questions, don't hesitate, just go. We'll talk in the morning when you're warm and the babies are safe." Amelia's mind reeled. "Dad, I can't afford." "You can afford anything you want," Jonathan said, and now she could hear something that sounded almost like amusement in his voice. "You always could. You just never knew it." The line went dead. Amelia stared at the phone, confusion mixing with the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright. What did he mean, she could afford anything? She'd been living off Nathaniel's income for years, had given up her own career to support his ambitions, had signed prenups that left her with virtually nothing if the marriage failed. She was exactly what Nathaniel had called her, a woman with no resources, no power, no options. Wasn't she? The twins were getting colder, their cries becoming weaker, and Amelia forced herself to move. 3 blocks north. The Commonwealth Hotel. She'd heard of it. Old Boston money, the kind of place where billionaires and politicians gathered to make deals that shaped the world. Not the kind of place where a woman in a blood-stained hospital gown would ever be welcome. But 20 minutes later, she stood in the marble lobby of the Commonwealth, and everything changed. "Ms. Winters," the concierge said the moment she approached the desk, as if he'd been waiting for her specifically. He was an older man with kind eyes and the sort of professional composure that suggested he'd seen everything and been surprised by nothing. "We've been expecting you. Let me escort you to your suite immediately." "I think there's been a mistake," Amelia began, but the man was already moving, gesturing to a team of staff members who appeared as if from nowhere. "No mistake at all. Your father made very specific arrangements. Dr. Patricia Mills is waiting upstairs to examine you and the babies, and we've had a full nursery prepared. If you'll follow me." The elevator ride to the penthouse passed in a blur. Amelia caught glimpses of herself in the mirrored walls, wild hair, exhausted eyes, hospital bracelets still on her wrist, and wondered if she was hallucinating from shock and blood loss. None of this made sense. Her father was a college professor. He lived in a modest house in Cambridge, drove a 10-year-old Honda, and spent his evenings grading papers and reading academic journals. Didn't he? The penthouse suite was larger than the entire first floor of the mansion Nathaniel had just expelled her from. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Boston Harbor, and the space was furnished with a kind of understated luxury that spoke of wealth so old and established it didn't need to announce itself. But what made Amelia's knees buckle was the nursery. A complete infant setup with 2 cribs, a changing station, baby clothes in every size, and medical equipment that belonged in a hospital. Dr. Mills turned out to be a pediatrician from Mass General who examined both babies with gentle efficiency, pronouncing them healthy despite their ordeal. She checked Amelia's surgical site, prescribed antibiotics for the infection that was just beginning, and arranged for a nurse to stay overnight. "Your father is very thorough," Dr. Mills said as she packed her equipment. "He's been planning for this possibility for quite some time." Planning for this possibility. The words echoed in Amelia's head as she finally settled into the enormous bed with her daughters sleeping peacefully in their cribs nearby. What did that mean? How could anyone plan for something like this? How had her father known that Nathaniel would? Her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Check your email. Password is your mother's maiden name plus the year we lost her. Sleep well, my dear. Tomorrow we begin. Dad." With shaking hands, Amelia opened her laptop. Somehow, impossibly, her own laptop was sitting on the bedside table, along with clothes in her exact size and everything else she could possibly need. The email account was one she'd never seen before, awinters@wintersglobal.com. Inside the inbox was a single message with dozens of attachments. The subject line read, "The truth about your inheritance." Amelia clicked open the first document and stared at the screen in disbelief. It was a trust document dated the day she was born, listing her as the beneficiary of assets totaling just over $3 billion. The second document was a corporate structure showing her as the heir apparent to Winters Global Holdings, a company she'd never heard of that apparently owned shipping companies, tech firms, real estate empires, and investment portfolios spanning 6 continents. The third document was a surveillance report on Nathaniel Ashford, complete with photos, financial records, and documented evidence of affairs dating back to the 2nd month of their marriage. Her father hadn't just been planning for this possibility. He'd been orchestrating it. As snow began to fall outside the penthouse windows, Amelia held her sleeping daughters and finally understood that the scared, powerless woman who'd been thrown out into the cold no longer existed. In her place sat someone with resources Nathaniel couldn't imagine, connections he'd never dreamed of, and a father who'd spent 6 years quietly preparing for war. Tomorrow, she would learn exactly what kind of weapons were at her disposal. Tonight, for the first time in years, she fell asleep knowing she was safe. Amelia woke to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the marble nightstand. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Commonwealth's penthouse, and for a moment, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back. The cold marble steps, Nathaniel's cruel dismissal, Scarlett's triumphant smile. Her hand instinctively moved to check the twins, but their cribs were empty. Panic shot through her until she heard soft voices from the living area. The overnight nurse, Rebecca, was feeding Grace while little Hope slept contentedly in a portable bassinet. Both babies looked healthier than they had in days, their color improved, their breathing steady. "Good morning, Ms. Winters," Rebecca said with a warm smile. They've been angels. Fed every 3 hours, no fussing. Dr. Mills left specific instructions about your antibiotics. They're on the counter with breakfast. Breakfast turned out to be an elaborate spread from the hotel's 5-star restaurant, but Amelia's attention was fixed on the man sitting at the dining table, reading financial reports on an iPad while sipping coffee from bone china. Her father looked exactly as she remembered, salt and pepper hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the same thoughtful expression he wore when grading papers. Except the papers spread before him now weren't student essays. They were acquisition reports for multinational corporations. "Hello, sweetheart," Jonathan Winters said without looking up. "How are you feeling?" "Confused," Amelia said honestly, settling into the chair across from him. "Dad, what is all this? The email, the trust documents, I don't understand any of it." Jonathan finally looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never noticed before. A hardness, a calculation that spoke of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions rather than lecture halls and academic conferences. "What don't you understand, specifically?" "All of it." Amelia gestured around the penthouse. "This suite probably costs more per night than I used to make in a month. You're a professor at Harvard. You drive a Honda and shop at discount stores. How do you have access to any of this?" Jonathan smiled, and it was the same gentle expression she remembered from childhood, but now she could see the steel underneath it. "I am a professor at Harvard. That part was never a lie. I enjoy teaching, enjoy working with young minds. But it's what you might call a hobby rather than a career." He reached for a leather portfolio and slid it across the table. "Winters Global Holdings was founded by your great-grandfather in 1923. We started with a single shipping vessel running cargo between Boston and Liverpool. Today, we own 847 vessels, control shipping lanes across 4 oceans, and generate approximately $14 billion in annual revenue. We also own significant stakes in telecommunications, renewable energy, real estate development, and emerging technologies." Amelia opened the portfolio and found herself staring at corporate organizational charts that read like a who's who of global industry. Companies she'd heard of, brands she used daily, all connected through a web of holdings and subsidiaries that eventually led back to one name, Winters Global. "But why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Why let me think we were just ordinary?" "Because ordinary was what you needed," Jonathan said gently. "Your mother and I wanted you to develop your own identity, your own values, before you understood what wealth could do, both the opportunities it creates and the people it attracts. We wanted you to be loved for who you were, not what you represented." The words hit her like ice water. "Nathaniel. You knew about Nathaniel from the beginning." Jonathan's expression darkened. "I knew Nathaniel Ashford was a predator the moment you introduced us. But you were 26 years old and in love, and I'd raised you to be independent. So I investigated him instead." He pulled out another folder, this one significantly thicker. Nathaniel Ashford graduated from Northwestern with a business degree and $70,000 in student loans. His first job was as a junior analyst at Morrison & Associates, where he was fired after 18 months for falsifying client reports. His second job was at Blackstone Financial, where he was caught embezzling funds to cover gambling debts. "Should I continue?" Amelia's hands trembled as she flipped through page after page of documented failures, lies, and increasingly desperate schemes. "But his consulting firm, Ashford Solutions, doesn't exist," Jonathan said flatly. "Or rather, it exists on paper only. Every client he claims to represent is actually a shell company I created. Every contract he's negotiated, every success he's celebrated, every dollar he's earned for the past 6 years has come directly from Winters Global accounts." The room seemed to spin. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your husband has been living off an allowance I've been providing since the week you got engaged. The mansion you lived in? Purchased through one of my subsidiaries and leased to him at $1 per year. The cars, the club memberships, the lifestyle he's been funding, all of it traced back to money I was funneling into accounts he thought belonged to satisfied clients. Amelia felt sick. You've been supporting him? Why would you? Because I was supporting you, Jonathan said firmly. I wanted my daughter to be happy, to feel secure, to live the life she chose. And I hoped, foolishly as it turns out, that financial stability might help Nathaniel become the man you believed him to be. But you were tracking everything. Every penny. Every lie. Every affair. Jonathan's voice grew colder. Did you know about Scarlett Davidson? Amelia's cheeks burned. I suspected, but I hoped I was wrong. You weren't wrong. Their relationship began 2 months after your wedding. She's been embezzling from his accounts, my accounts, technically, for the past year. Small amounts at first, then larger. She's currently sitting on approximately $200,000 she thinks Nathaniel doesn't know about. Does he know? Nathaniel doesn't know because Nathaniel has never looked closely at any financial statement in his life. He assumed the money would always flow, that his success was inevitable, that his charm and your devotion would sustain him indefinitely. He never bothered to learn where the funds originated or how they were structured. Jonathan stood and walked to the windows overlooking Boston Harbor. In the distance, Amelia could see massive cargo ships moving slowly toward port, ships that, apparently, her family owned. 6 months ago, I began shutting down the pipeline, he continued. Slowly, carefully, making it look like natural business fluctuations. Nathaniel's clients started delaying payments. His contracts began requiring more extensive negotiations. His income dropped by 60%, and he responded exactly as I predicted, by becoming more controlling, more desperate, more willing to show his true nature. You orchestrated this, Amelia breathed. You made this happen. Jonathan turned back to her, his expression serious. I created the conditions that would reveal who Nathaniel really was. What he chose to do with those conditions was entirely up to him. He could have been honest with you about the financial pressures. He could have sought your support, your partnership. Instead, he chose to blame you for his failures and replace you with someone he thought could provide access to different resources. Scarlett doesn't have resources. No, but her father is a federal judge, and Nathaniel believed that connection would be useful for his long-term plans. He's been investigating ways to challenge prenuptial agreements, looking for legal precedents that might allow him to claim a portion of assets he assumed you'd inherited. The full picture was becoming clear now, and it was uglier than Amelia had imagined. He married me for money he thought I had, stayed married to me for money you were providing, and replaced me for connections he thought would help him steal money he believed I'd inherited. That's a very succinct summary, Jonathan said. The irony, of course, is that you do have inherited money. Considerably more than he ever dreamed of. And as of yesterday, when he violated the morality clause in his employment contract by committing domestic abandonment, every dollar that's been supporting his lifestyle for 6 years just stopped flowing. Amelia looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw a man who'd spent 6 years playing chess while his opponent thought they were playing checkers. What happens now? Jonathan smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, it reached his eyes. Now, my dear, we give Nathaniel Ashford exactly what he's earned. And we make sure he understands that underestimating a Winters woman was the most expensive mistake of his very expensive life. Through the windows, the morning sun glinted off the harbor where Winters' global ships carried cargo worth billions of dollars around the world. Soon, those same ships would carry news of what happened when someone tried to destroy the only daughter of one of the most powerful men in North America. Nathaniel had thrown away a woman who could have given him everything. Now he was about to discover what nothing actually looked like. Margaret Thorne arrived at the Commonwealth Hotel at exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, her silver Aston Martin pulling up to the valet stand with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to moving through Boston's elite circles without fanfare. She was a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, but it was her eyes that commanded attention, sharp, calculating, and utterly merciless when focused on an opponent. She'd been Jonathan Winter's chief legal strategist for 15 years, handling everything from hostile takeovers to international trade disputes. But this case was personal. She'd watched Amelia grow up, had been present for birthday parties and graduations, and had spent the last 6 years documenting every detail of Nathaniel Ashford's systematic emotional abuse. "Amelia," Margaret said warmly as she entered the penthouse, though her expression hardened when she saw the fading bruises on Amelia's wrist, marks from where Nathaniel had grabbed her during their final argument. "How are you feeling today?" "Overwhelmed," Amelia admitted, bouncing Little Hope gently while Grace slept in her carrier. "Dad's been explaining the family business, and I'm trying to process that my entire marriage was essentially a performance funded by my own inheritance." Margaret set her briefcase on the dining table and began extracting files with the efficiency of someone preparing for war. "It's worse than a performance, my dear. It was a systematic exploitation designed to isolate you from your support systems while positioning Nathaniel to claim maximum assets in the event of a divorce. He's been playing a very sophisticated long game." She opened the first file and spread photographs across the table. They showed Nathaniel at various restaurants, hotels, and private clubs, always with Scarlett, sometimes with other women Amelia didn't recognize. The dates went back 4 years. "We've been monitoring his activities since your father first expressed concerns about the marriage," Margaret continued. "What you see here represents just a fraction of our documentation. Financial fraud, adultery, emotional manipulation, corporate embezzlement. We have enough evidence to destroy him in court and ensure he never works in Boston again." Amelia stared at a photograph of Nathaniel and Scarlett kissing outside the Four Seasons, dated just 2 weeks after Grace and Hope were born. "All this time, while I was struggling with postpartum recovery, thinking I was failing as a wife. You were being systematically gaslit by a man who saw you as an obstacle to his financial goals," Margaret said firmly. "Nathaniel Ashford is a sociopath who married you for access to resources he assumed you controlled. When he realized the money came through your father, he began positioning himself to claim those resources through legal manipulation." Jonathan entered from the study, carrying a tablet and looking grimmer than he had the night before. "Nathaniel's begun implementing what he thinks is his endgame. As of an hour ago, he filed for emergency custody of the twins, claiming you abandoned them voluntarily. He's also initiated divorce proceedings with a motion to freeze all marital assets pending a full audit of what he calls suspicious financial arrangements in our family." Amelia felt ice settle in her stomach. "He's trying to take my daughters?" "He's trying to use your daughters as leverage," Margaret corrected. "Nathaniel doesn't want to raise children. He wants to control you by threatening to separate you from them. It's a classic abuser tactic, elevated to a legal strategy." She pulled out another folder, this one containing legal documents bearing the seal of Suffolk County Family Court. "He's claiming that your father's financial support constitutes parental manipulation, that you're financially dependent and therefore unstable, and that the twins would be better served in a stable 2-parent household with adequate resources." "But he doesn't have adequate resources," Amelia protested. "You just told me his income has been cut by 60%. "He doesn't know that yet," Jonathan said with a slight smile. "Remember, we've been reducing his income gradually. To Nathaniel, it looks like normal business fluctuations. He assumes the money will return once he resolves what he sees as the problem, namely, your influence over what he believes are family assets." Margaret's expression grew predatory. "Which brings us to phase 1 of our response strategy. We're going to give Nathaniel exactly what he thinks he wants, a legal battle over assets and custody. What he doesn't realize is that every motion he files, every claim he makes, every aggressive move he attempts will create legal precedents that favor us and generate documentation we can use to destroy him completely." She began laying out a timeline on the table, marking specific dates and legal actions. "Step 1. We respond to his custody motion with a counterfiling that includes documented evidence of abandonment, adultery, and financial instability. Step 2. We audit all accounts associated with his business, revealing the embezzlement and fraud he's been committing. Step 3. We demonstrate to the court that his sudden concern for the children's welfare coincides suspiciously with his discovery that they might represent access to significant assets. What about Scarlett? Amelia asked. Scarlett Davidson is going to be our star witness, Margaret said with satisfaction. She's been skimming money from accounts she believes belong to Nathaniel, which means she's technically embezzling from Winters Global. We have surveillance footage, bank records, and recorded conversations where she explicitly discusses using the stolen funds to establish herself independently. Jonathan leaned forward. More importantly, we have recordings of Nathaniel discussing his plans to use the twins as negotiation tools in what he called the inevitable financial discussion with our family. He's been quite explicit about his intentions with Scarlett, assuming she's completely loyal to his interests.
She's not.
Margaret smiled coldly. Scarlett Davidson is many things, but she's not stupid. She's been positioning herself as Nathaniel's devoted partner while simultaneously creating an exit strategy that involves maximum financial benefit for herself. When she realizes that Nathaniel has no actual assets and never did, her loyalty will evaporate quite rapidly. She pulled out a final document, this one bearing the letterhead of Pierce, Hamilton and Associates, Boston's most prestigious family law firm. Which is why we're going to offer Scarlett a choice. Testify truthfully about Nathaniel's behavior and financial misconduct in exchange for immunity from prosecution, or face federal charges for embezzlement, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Amelia looked between her father and Margaret, beginning to understand the scope of what they'd been planning. How long have you been preparing for this? Since the day you announced your engagement, Jonathan said simply. I hoped I was wrong about Nathaniel, truly hoped that love would transform him into someone worthy of your devotion. But I also knew that hope without preparation was simply wishful thinking. We've been building this case for 6 years, Margaret added. Every financial transaction, every communication, every public appearance has been documented and verified. Nathaniel thinks he's fighting a woman who just gave birth and has no resources. He's actually challenging one of the most powerful families in North America, and he's doing it with evidence we've been gathering since before his first affair. The scope of it was overwhelming. While Amelia had been struggling to save her marriage, to be a better wife, to understand why her husband seemed increasingly distant and cruel, her father had been quietly constructing an impenetrable legal fortress around her and her future children. What do you need me to do? Amelia asked. Margaret's expression softened slightly. For now, you focus on recovering and caring for your daughters. We'll handle the legal maneuvering. But Amelia, you need to understand something crucial. Once we begin this process, there's no going back. Nathaniel will be completely destroyed, financially, professionally, personally. Are you prepared for that level of warfare? Amelia looked at her daughters, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos their father had brought into their lives. She thought about the cold marble steps, the sound of the door slamming, Scarlett's triumphant laughter. She remembered every dismissive comment, every calculated insult, every moment when Nathaniel had made her feel small and worthless and grateful for whatever scraps of affection he chose to offer. He threw his own children into the street, she said quietly. He called them bastards. He replaced their mother before they were even a week old. She looked up, and Margaret saw something hard and final in her eyes. Destroy him. Margaret smiled and began gathering the files. Consider it done. Outside the penthouse windows, Boston continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in a luxury suite overlooking the harbor, 3 of the most powerful people in New England were finalizing plans that would reshape the city's social and business landscape forever. Nathaniel Ashford had thrown away a woman who could have given him the world. Now he was about to discover what it felt like when that world turned against him with precision, patience, and unlimited resources. The next 2 weeks passed like a carefully choreographed ballet of legal maneuvering and strategic positioning. While Nathaniel celebrated what he believed was his masterstroke, filing for emergency custody and divorce proceedings, Margaret's team worked around the clock to document every aspect of his crumbling empire. What Nathaniel didn't realize was that his aggressive legal moves were providing exactly the evidence they needed to demonstrate his true motivations. Amelia had moved into a penthouse apartment on Newberry Street, a property that had been sitting empty in the Winters global real estate portfolio. To outside observers, it appeared she was living modestly on whatever savings she'd managed to accumulate during her marriage. In reality, she was residing in a $12 million property with round-the-clock security, private nursing care for the twins, and access to resources Nathaniel couldn't even imagine. The apartment itself was a study in understated luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the public garden, period moldings that spoke of old Boston wealth, and furnishings that managed to be both comfortable and museum quality. But more importantly, it was equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment that would capture every interaction she had with Nathaniel or his representatives. "He's getting desperate," Margaret reported during one of their daily strategy sessions. She spread new documents across the dining table while Amelia fed Grace. "His income has dropped another 20% this week as we've continued shutting down the shell companies that were funneling him money. He's maxed out 3 credit cards and taken a second mortgage on the Beacon Hill house." "A second mortgage he can't legally take," Jonathan added from his position by the windows, where he'd been watching unmarked surveillance vehicles position themselves across the street. Since Winters Global technically owns the property through subsidiary holdings, his mortgage applications constitute fraud. "We're letting them go through so we can add bank fraud to our growing list of charges." Amelia shook her head in amazement. "He still doesn't realize what's happening?" "Nathaniel has never had to think strategically about money because money has always simply appeared when he needed it," Margaret explained. "He's operating under the assumption that his current problems are temporary setbacks that will resolve once he gains access to what he believes are your family assets. He's actually borrowed against the projected value of those assets to fund his legal team." "Speaking of his legal team," Jonathan said, turning from the window with a grim expression, "Gerald Patterson is no longer representing him. Nathaniel couldn't make the retainer payments." Margaret looked surprised. "Patterson's out? Who's he using now?" "David Kellerman from Kellerman and Associates." "Never heard of him." "Neither had I until this morning. He graduated from Suffolk Law 3 years ago, failed the bar exam twice, and has primarily handled traffic violations and small claims disputes. This will be his first family court case." Amelia felt a mixture of pity and satisfaction. "He's really lost everything, hasn't he?" "Not everything," Margaret corrected. "He still has Scarlett, still has the house for another few weeks, and still believes he's going to win custody of the twins and access to the Winters fortune. Which brings us to phase 2 of our strategy." She opened a new file containing what appeared to be architectural plans and surveillance photos. "We're going to give Nathaniel an opportunity to demonstrate exactly what kind of father he'd be. Tomorrow afternoon, he's scheduled for his first supervised visitation with the twins. Court-mandated 2 hours, with a social worker present to observe his interactions." "I don't want him near my daughters," Amelia said immediately, her arms tightening protectively around Grace. "I understand your concern," Margaret said gently, "but legally, he has parental rights until we can prove he's unfit. However, we're going to ensure that this visitation provides all the evidence we need to terminate those rights permanently." Jonathan joined them at the table, pulling out a tablet that showed multiple camera angles of what appeared to be a child-friendly visitation room. "The court-appointed facility where the visitation will take place has been enhanced with additional monitoring equipment. Every word Nathaniel speaks, every interaction he has with the children, every moment of frustration or impatience will be recorded. More importantly," Margaret continued, "we've arranged for the social worker to be Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who specializes in identifying parental manipulation and has testified in over 200 custody cases. She's also been briefed on Nathaniel's psychological profile and will know exactly what warning signs to watch for." Amelia studied the surveillance setup, beginning to understand the scope of the trap they were setting. You're expecting him to reveal his true nature during the visitation? Nathaniel has never spent more than 15 minutes alone with your daughters, Margaret pointed out. He's never changed a diaper, never dealt with crying infants, never experienced the reality of childcare. We're betting that 2 hours of actual parenting responsibility will strip away whatever facade he's constructed for the court. And if he surprises us and actually tries to be a good father? Amelia asked. Jonathan's expression grew cold. Then we'll have evidence of his capacity for deception, which is equally valuable for our purposes. But honestly, sweetheart, I don't think you need to worry about that scenario. Over the next 24 hours, Amelia found herself in the strange position of preparing her daughters to be used as evidence against their own father. She worked with Dr. Rodriguez to establish the twins' normal routines, their feeding schedules, their preferences, and their typical responses to unfamiliar situations. Grace tended to be colicky in the afternoons, while Hope was generally calm but became fussy when hungry. Both babies were exclusively breastfed and would likely become distressed when separated from their mother for extended periods. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. Alright, let's get back to it. This feels wrong, Amelia confessed to Margaret the night before the visitation. Using my own children as bait. You're not using them as bait, Margaret corrected firmly. You're protecting them by documenting their father's unfitness before he can do lasting damage. Every day we delay this process is another day Nathaniel can claim parental rights, another day he can use them as leverage against you. She's right, Jonathan added. Nathaniel made his choice when he threw you and the babies out. Now we're simply ensuring that choice has permanent consequences. The morning of the visitation, Amelia dressed the twins in simple white onesies, innocent, vulnerable, impossible to ignore. She nursed them both thoroughly, knowing they wouldn't be able to feed again for several hours, and tried to project calm despite the anxiety clawing at her chest. Dr. Rodriguez will intervene if anything goes wrong, Margaret assured her as they prepared to leave for the facility. And remember, our security team will be monitoring every feed. If Nathaniel shows even a hint of aggression or frustration toward the children, we can terminate the visitation immediately. The supervised visitation facility was located in a nondescript building near downtown, designed to feel comfortable and non-threatening while maintaining strict security protocols. Amelia carried the twins into a cheerfully decorated room with soft lighting, age-appropriate toys, and cameras discreetly positioned to capture every angle. Dr. Rodriguez was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the sort of professional demeanor that put nervous parents at ease while missing nothing important. She greeted Amelia warmly, checked that the babies were settled, and reviewed the visitation protocols one final time. Mr. Ashford should arrive within the next few minutes, Dr. Rodriguez said. I'll be observing from the adjacent room, but I'll intervene if necessary. Try not to worry, we'll take excellent care of your daughters. Amelia kissed each baby goodbye, whispering promises that she'd return soon, and left feeling like she was feeding her children to wolves. But as she walked to the observation room where Margaret was waiting, she reminded herself that this was necessary. Better to expose Nathaniel's true nature in a controlled environment than to risk years of custody battles where he could manipulate the system. At exactly 2 o'clock, Nathaniel arrived for his first real test as a father. Within 30 minutes, Margaret was calling Jonathan to arrange emergency termination proceedings. The man who'd thrown his children into the December cold was about to discover that some mistakes couldn't be corrected, only punished. Nathaniel Ashford arrived at the supervised visitation facility 15 minutes late, wearing a rumpled suit that suggested he'd slept in his car. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his eyes were bloodshot, and he carried the distinct odor of someone who'd been drinking heavily the night before. Dr. Rodriguez noted all of this in her initial assessment, along with the fact that he'd brought no supplies for the babies. No diapers, no bottles, no toys, nothing that suggested any preparation for caring for infant twins. Mr. Ashford, Dr. Rodriguez said professionally as she led him into the visitation room where Grace and Hope lay in their carriers. Thank you for coming today. I'll be observing from the next room to ensure everything goes smoothly. The babies were fed about an hour ago, so they should be content for most of your visit." Nathaniel barely glanced at her, his attention focused on the twins with an expression that was difficult to read. Not love, not excitement, not even curiosity, more like someone examining assets he was considering purchasing. 2 hours? He asked, checking his expensive watch. That seems excessive for babies this young. They probably won't even know I'm here. Actually, infants begin bonding with their parents from birth, Dr. Rodriguez explained. This time allows you to establish a connection with your daughters through feeding, playing, and basic care interactions. Right, Nathaniel said dismissively. Well, let's get this over with. From the observation room, Amelia watched through one-way glass while Margaret took detailed notes and their surveillance team recorded everything from multiple angles. Jonathan stood behind them, his jaw clenched, his hands clasped behind his back to hide their shaking. "This is already going worse than I expected," Margaret murmured as they watched Nathaniel approach the babies. Nathaniel stood over the carriers for several seconds, making no move to interact with his daughters. Grace began making soft cooing sounds, the kind that usually delighted new parents and prompted immediate engagement. Nathaniel ignored her completely, instead pulling out his phone and checking his messages. "Are you supposed to just stare at them?" he called toward the observation window. "Because this is extremely boring." Dr. Rodriguez's voice came through the intercom. "You might try picking one of them up, talking to them, or simply letting them know you're present. Babies respond to voices, gentle touch, and eye contact." Nathaniel sighed theatrically and reached for Hope, lifting her with the awkward uncertainty of someone who'd never held an infant. Hope immediately began crying, not the distressed wailing of a baby in pain, but the confused whimpering of a child being handled by a stranger. "Why is it making that noise?" Nathaniel asked, holding Hope at arm's length like she was something unpleasant. "Make it stop." "She's crying because she doesn't know you," Dr. Rodriguez explained patiently. "Try holding her closer to your chest, speaking softly, maybe walking around the room." Instead, Nathaniel placed Hope back in her carrier and stepped away. "This is ridiculous. They're too young for this to matter. Can't we just sit them somewhere and let them sleep?" Grace chose that moment to begin crying as well, her small voice joining her sister's in a chorus that filled the room. The sound that would prompt most fathers to immediate action, soothing, rocking, desperate attempts at comfort, caused Nathaniel to cover his ears and move toward the far corner of the room. "Do something about the noise," he demanded. "I can't think with that racket." In the observation room, Amelia's hands were pressed against the glass, every maternal instinct screaming at her to rush in and comfort her babies. Margaret had to physically restrain her. "Let him show us who he really is," Margaret said firmly. "This is evidence we need." What happened next exceeded even their worst expectations. As both babies continued crying, Nathaniel's composure completely disintegrated. He began pacing the room like a caged animal, muttering angrily about performing monkeys and manipulative women using children as weapons. "I don't have time for this," he announced loudly, speaking toward the observation window. "I have actual problems to solve. Real business to conduct. I can't waste 2 hours babysitting when there are important things happening." Dr. Rodriguez entered the room immediately. "Mr. Ashford, your daughters need comfort. They're crying because they're in an unfamiliar environment with someone they don't know. This is your opportunity to establish a bond with them." "Bond with them?" Nathaniel's voice rose to near shouting. "They're 4 weeks old. They don't bond with anything except food and sleep. This whole exercise is pointless legal theater designed to waste my time and drain my resources." He gestured aggressively toward the crying babies. "You want to know the truth? I don't want to bond with them. I never wanted children in the first place. Amelia trapped me into this situation, and now everyone expects me to pretend I'm grateful for the burden." Dr. Rodriguez stepped protectively closer to the babies. "Mr. Ashford, please lower your voice. You're frightening the children."
Good.
Nathaniel exploded. Maybe they'll learn early not to expect things from people who never asked for their existence. Their mother wants to play games with custody and assets? Fine. But don't expect me to pretend I enjoy playing house with the consequences of her manipulation. The room fell silent except for the twins' continued crying. Dr. Rodriguez was already moving toward the emergency button that would summon security and terminate the visitation immediately. Furthermore, Nathaniel continued, apparently unaware that he was destroying any hope of future custody, if Amelia thinks she can use these children to access my family's resources, she's even more deluded than I thought. Children are liabilities, not assets. They consume resources without generating value, and anyone who chooses to have them deserves whatever financial hardship results. Dr. Rodriguez pressed the emergency button. Security personnel entered within seconds, but Nathaniel wasn't finished. "The only reason I'm fighting for custody is to prevent Amelia from poisoning them against me," he announced to the room. "Children should be raised by the parent with superior judgment and resources, not by someone who thinks emotional manipulation constitutes parenting strategy." As security escorted him from the building, Nathaniel's final words echoed through the facility. "This isn't over. Those children represent financial leverage, and I won't be cheated out of what's rightfully mine." In the observation room, Amelia was sobbing, not from sadness, but from pure rage. Her daughters were still crying, needing comfort their father had refused to provide, while he just admitted on camera that he saw them as financial instruments rather than human beings. Margaret was already on her phone with the emergency family court judge. "Your Honor, we have video evidence of parental abandonment, emotional abuse, and explicit statements of intent to exploit minor children for financial gain. We're requesting immediate termination of all parental rights and a restraining order to prevent further contact." Jonathan had moved to comfort his granddaughters, lifting Grace while Dr. Rodriguez tended to Hope. Both babies quieted immediately in the arms of people who genuinely cared about their well-being. "How long will it take?" Amelia asked, wiping her eyes. "Emergency hearing tomorrow morning," Margaret said, closing her phone. With this evidence, Nathaniel will never see these children again. He'll also face criminal charges for child endangerment and making terroristic threats in a supervised facility. But Margaret's expression remained grim despite their legal victory. "There's something else." During his outburst, Nathaniel mentioned accessing his family's resources. He's still operating under the assumption that his income problems are temporary, that he has assets to leverage against our legal action. Jonathan looked up from where he was gently rocking Grace. "Then it's time for him to discover exactly what he actually owns." "Phase 3?" Amelia asked. Margaret nodded. "Phase 3. Tomorrow morning, while we're terminating his parental rights, our financial team will be seizing every asset he thinks he controls. Every account, every property, every business interest he believes belongs to him." "And Scarlett?" "Scarlett's about to receive a very interesting phone call from the FBI regarding her embezzlement activities. I suspect her loyalty to Nathaniel will evaporate rather quickly when she realizes he can't protect her from federal charges." As they prepared to leave the facility with the twins, Amelia realized that Nathaniel had just handed them everything they needed to destroy him completely. His own words, his own actions, his own complete failure as a father had provided irrefutable evidence that he was unfit to raise children and motivated solely by financial greed. Tomorrow, he would wake up expecting to continue his legal battle for custody and assets. Instead, he would discover that he'd lost his children, his freedom, and every penny he'd thought belonged to him. The man who'd called his daughters liabilities was about to learn what being an actual liability felt like. The emergency family court hearing convened at 8 o'clock the following morning in Judge Patricia Monroe's chambers. Nathaniel arrived with David Kellerman, his inexperienced attorney, looking haggard and desperate. His suit was wrinkled, his hands shook slightly, and there was a manic energy about him that suggested he'd spent the night consuming caffeine and probably something stronger while plotting his defense. Judge Monroe was a stern woman in her 60s who'd presided over family court for 23 years and had developed an uncanny ability to see through legal manipulation. She'd already reviewed the video evidence from yesterday's visitation, and her expression suggested she found Nathaniel's behavior deeply disturbing. "Mr. Ashford," Judge Monroe began without preamble, "I've reviewed the surveillance footage from your supervised visitation yesterday. Before we proceed with today's hearing, I want to give you an opportunity to explain your recorded statements about viewing your children as financial leverage and your assertion that you never wanted children in the first place." Kellerman stood awkwardly, clearly unprepared for the directness of the judge's approach. "Your Honor, my client was under extreme stress during the visitation. The artificial nature of the supervised environment, combined with the emotional pressure of the custody proceedings, led to statements that don't reflect his true feelings about his daughters."
"I see," Judge Monroe said dryly.
"And his statement that children should be raised by the parent with superior judgment and resources, not by someone who thinks emotional manipulation constitutes parenting strategy, was that also a product of stress?" Nathaniel leaned forward, his composure cracking.
"Your Honor, if I may speak directly."
"You may not," Judge Monroe said sharply. "Your attorney will speak for you, or you'll remain silent. Those are your options." But Nathaniel was beyond caring about legal protocol. The pressure of losing his income, facing mounting debts, and watching his carefully constructed world collapse had pushed him past rational decision-making. "This entire proceeding is a fraud," he announced, standing up despite Kellerman's attempts to restrain him. "Amelia Winters is using her family's money to manipulate the legal system, to buy outcomes that favor her manufactured narrative."
"I'm the victim here, not her."
Judge Monroe's eyebrows rose. "You consider yourself the victim, Mr. Ashford?" "Absolutely. I married a woman who presented herself as independent and self-sufficient, only to discover that her entire family is involved in some kind of financial conspiracy designed to control my life and my assets. They've been monitoring my business activities, interfering with my income streams, and now they're using our children as weapons against me." Margaret, who'd been taking careful notes, looked up with interest. Nathaniel was providing even more evidence of his delusions and paranoia than they'd hoped for. "Furthermore," Nathaniel continued, his voice rising, "I have reason to believe that Amelia's pregnancy was planned specifically to create leverage in what was always intended to be a divorce proceeding designed to maximize her financial settlement. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too perfect." Judge Monroe's expression had shifted from stern to genuinely appalled. "Mr. Ashford, are you suggesting that your wife deliberately conceived children as part of an elaborate financial scheme?" "I'm saying the evidence suggests that possibility," Nathaniel replied, apparently believing he was making a compelling legal argument. "And I'm requesting that this court order a full investigation into the Winters family financial empire before making any custody determinations that could be influenced by their obvious wealth and political connections." Kellerman had given up trying to control his client and was frantically scribbling notes, probably preparing to withdraw from the case before it damaged his fledgling career beyond repair. Judge Monroe turned to Margaret. "Ms. Thorne, I assume you have a response to these allegations?" Margaret stood gracefully, her expression serene. "Your Honor, we welcome any investigation into our family's financial activities. In fact, we've prepared a comprehensive disclosure of all assets, holdings, and business interests that might be relevant to this proceeding." She gestured to her assistant, who began distributing thick folders to the judge and court clerk. "What you'll find is that Winters Global Holdings is one of the most transparent and legally compliant corporations in North America. Every transaction is documented, every tax obligation fulfilled, every regulatory requirement exceeded. More importantly," Margaret continued, "you'll find that Mr. Ashford has been a beneficiary of this family's financial support since the day he married our daughter. Every success he celebrated, Every client he's served, every dollar he's earned for the past 6 years has been provided by Jonathan Winters through legitimate business arrangements designed to ensure his daughter's happiness and security. Nathaniel's face went white as the implications hit him. That's impossible. I built my consulting firm from nothing. I have clients, contracts, proven results. You have shell companies that my father created to funnel you money, Amelia said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the courtroom. Every contract you've signed, every payment you've received, every business relationship you've celebrated was carefully orchestrated to provide you with income while my father monitored your behavior as a husband and potential father. The room fell silent except for the sound of pages turning as Judge Monroe reviewed the financial documentation. After several minutes, she looked up with an expression of complete bewilderment. Mr. Ashford, according to these records, you have no independent income, no legitimate business assets, and no financial resources beyond what the Winters family has been providing. Is that accurate? Nathaniel was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. No, that can't be right. I have accounts, investments, properties, all of which were purchased or funded with Winters' global money, Margaret said matter-of-factly, including the Beacon Hill mansion you've been living in, which is owned by one of our subsidiary companies and leased to you for $1 per year. But the mortgage papers were created by our legal team to maintain the illusion that you had legitimate assets to leverage, Margaret continued. My client's father wanted his daughter to feel secure in her marriage, even if that security required creative financial arrangements. Judge Monroe was shaking her head in amazement. Mr. Ashford, you've been essentially living on an allowance provided by your wife's family, and you're now arguing that this same family is somehow manipulating you financially? The full reality was finally penetrating Nathaniel's consciousness, and his response was immediate and explosive. You people are criminals, he shouted, pointing accusingly at Amelia and Margaret. This is fraud on a massive scale. You've been controlling my life, manipulating my business, stealing my identity. We've been supporting a man who married our daughter under false pretenses, Jonathan said calmly, speaking from the gallery where he'd been observing. A man who represented himself as successful and independent when he was actually facing bankruptcy and criminal charges for embezzlement at his previous employment. He stood and approached the bench. Your Honor, if I may submit additional evidence regarding Mr. Ashford's background prior to his marriage to my daughter? Judge Monroe nodded, and Jonathan handed over another folder. This one contained Nathaniel's complete employment history, including the documented fraud at Morrison & Associates and the embezzlement charges at Blackstone Financial that had been quietly settled to avoid prosecution. Mr. Ashford has a pattern of financial deception going back more than a decade, Jonathan continued. He married my daughter specifically because he believed she represented access to resources he could exploit. When that exploitation was no longer sufficient to maintain his lifestyle, he began planning to abandon her and their children in favor of someone he believed could provide different advantages. Nathaniel was beyond rational response now, his voice reaching near hysterical levels. This is a conspiracy. You've been planning this for years, setting me up, creating evidence, manipulating everything to destroy me. We've been protecting our daughter from a predator, Jonathan said simply, and documenting his behavior so that when he inevitably revealed his true nature, we'd have the evidence necessary to ensure he could never harm her or her children again. Judge Monroe closed the files and looked directly at Nathaniel. Mr. Ashford, based on the evidence presented today, including your own statements and behavior, I'm terminating all parental rights immediately. You are prohibited from any contact with the minor children, and I'm issuing a restraining order requiring you to stay at least 500 feet away from Ms. Winters and her residence. You can't do this, Nathaniel screamed. This is judicial corruption. These people bought you. Judge Monroe's expression turned glacial. Mr. Ashford, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, please remove him from my courtroom and arrange for a psychiatric evaluation. I'm also referring this matter to the district attorney for possible criminal prosecution related to the threats made during yesterday's supervised visitation. As security escorted Nathaniel from the courtroom, his final words echoed through the chamber. "I'll appeal this. I'll expose all of you. You haven't won anything." But his protests were hollow, and everyone in the room knew it. In less than 24 hours, Nathaniel Ashford had lost his children, his freedom, and any hope of accessing the assets he believed would fund his legal battle. Phase 3 was about to begin, and Nathaniel would soon discover that losing his parental rights was only the beginning of his problems. 3 hours after his humiliating removal from family court, Nathaniel stood in the marble foyer of the Beacon Hill mansion, staring at an eviction notice that had been personally served by a team of federal marshals. The document was thick, official, and utterly devastating in its clinical precision. He had 72 hours to remove his personal belongings and vacate the premises. Any items left behind would be considered abandoned property and disposed of at the discretion of the actual owner, Winters Global Holdings, LLC. The house felt different now that he knew the truth about who owned it. The Persian rugs he'd admired, the crystal chandeliers he'd shown off to business associates, the wine cellar he'd stocked with vintage bottles, none of it had ever belonged to him. He'd been living in a museum of his own delusions, playing house with borrowed furniture while the real owners watched and documented his every move. Scarlett emerged from the kitchen carrying a suitcase, her face pale and her usual confidence replaced by barely contained panic. "The FBI was here," she announced without preamble. "They showed me recordings of my financial transactions, bank statements I thought were private, evidence of what they're calling systematic embezzlement." "Nathaniel, they have everything. What did you tell them?" Nathaniel asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "I told them the truth. That you gave me access to business accounts and told me to handle certain expenses. That I thought the money belonged to your consulting firm. That I had no idea it was actually coming from Winters Global." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "You threw me under the bus." "I threw myself a lifeline," Scarlett corrected sharply. "Because unlike you, I'm not delusional enough to think I can fight a federal investigation backed by unlimited resources. The FBI offered me immunity in exchange for my testimony about your financial activities and your statements about using the children for leverage." She moved toward the door, pausing only to deliver her final blow. "Oh, and Nathaniel? They told me something interesting about our romantic relationship. Apparently, your wife's family has recordings of you discussing me as a useful connection because of my father's position on the federal bench. You never loved me either, did you? I was just another resource you were planning to exploit." The door slammed behind her, leaving Nathaniel alone in the vast house that had never been his. He walked through rooms where he'd entertained business associates, where he'd planned his future, where he'd felt like a successful man with unlimited potential. Now every surface seemed to mock him, every expensive object a reminder of how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. His phone rang, his attorney, David Kellerman, calling with what Nathaniel suspected would be more bad news. "Nathaniel, I'm withdrawing from your case," Kellerman said without preamble. "What happened in court today was professional suicide. I can't represent someone who accuses federal judges of corruption and makes terroristic threats about children." "You can't abandon me now." "Watch me," Kellerman said flatly. "Also, you should know that the Massachusetts Bar Association is reviewing your behavior for possible sanctions against any attorney who represents you in the future. Good luck finding counsel." The line went dead. Nathaniel's next call was to his bank, hoping to access emergency funds for legal representation. The automated system cheerfully informed him that all his accounts had been frozen pending a federal investigation. His credit cards had been canceled. His business accounts were under audit by the IRS. In the space of one day, he'd lost his children, his home, his legal representation, and every dollar he'd thought he controlled. But worse was yet to come. At 6 o'clock that evening, as Nathaniel sat in his empty kitchen trying to process the magnitude of his collapse, a convoy of black SUVs pulled into his driveway. FBI agents in tactical gear surrounded the house while forensic accountants began loading boxes of documents into evidence trucks. His computers, phones, and financial records were seized as part of what the lead agent described as an investigation into interstate fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. We have a warrant to search these premises for evidence related to the fraudulent operation of Ashford Solutions Consulting and associated shell companies, Agent Maria Santos announced as she presented the legal documents. You have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. I suggest you exercise both of those rights immediately. This is harassment, Nathaniel protested, though his voice lacked conviction. I'm the victim of a wealthy family's manipulation, not the perpetrator of any crime. Agent Santos looked at him with the expression of someone who'd heard every possible excuse during her 15 years investigating white-collar crime. Mr. Ashford, we have documented evidence of your signature on fraudulent tax documents claiming business income you knew was fictitious. We have recordings of you discussing plans to exploit federal court connections through romantic relationships. We have testimony from your former mistress detailing your explicit plans to use minor children as financial leverage. She gestured toward the evidence teams systematically dismantling his life. This isn't harassment. This is law enforcement responding to a pattern of criminal behavior that spans multiple jurisdictions and involves federal tax fraud, interstate conspiracy, and child exploitation. As the agents worked, Nathaniel's neighbors began gathering on the sidewalk, their phones out, recording everything for social media posts that would ensure his humiliation reached every corner of Boston's social scene. Mrs. Patterson from 3 doors down, who'd once complimented him on his business acumen, was live-streaming his arrest to her 2,000 followers. Mr. Chen, the retired banker who'd expressed interest in investing in Ashford Solutions, was texting frantically, probably warning mutual acquaintances to avoid any association with Nathaniel's name. The public nature of his destruction was as carefully orchestrated as everything else the Winters family had done. By tomorrow morning, everyone in their social circle would know that Nathaniel Ashford was a fraud, a criminal, and a man who'd threatened his own children when his deceptions were exposed. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Ashford, this is Margaret Thorne. I thought you should know that we've also filed civil lawsuits to recover the approximately $4 million in Winters Global funds you've spent over the past 6 years. Since you signed documents claiming that money as business income, you're liable for taxes, penalties, and interest on the full amount. We estimate your total debt to be approximately $7 million. Your bankruptcy attorney, when you find one willing to represent you, will need these figures for your inevitable insolvency filing. A second text followed immediately. Also, the recordings of your threats toward the children have been forwarded to every family law attorney in New England. I doubt you'll find representation for any future custody appeals. Enjoy your new life, Mr. Ashford. You've earned every bit of it. As the FBI teams finished loading the last boxes of evidence, Agent Santos approached Nathaniel with handcuffs. Nathaniel Ashford, you're under arrest for federal tax fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and making terroristic threats against minor children. You have the right to remain silent. The neighbors recorded everything as Nathaniel was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. The mansion he'd thought was his stood empty behind him, its windows dark, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of delusions that had finally been exposed to daylight. By midnight, footage of his arrest was trending on local news sites and social media platforms across New England. The man who'd thrown his wife and newborn twins into the December cold was now facing decades in federal prison, millions in civil judgments, and complete social ostracism. He'd wanted to destroy Amelia because he thought she was powerless. Instead, he destroyed himself by underestimating exactly how powerful her family actually was. The Winters family had played a perfect game, and Nathaniel had been checkmated without ever realizing he was just a pawn on someone else's board. The federal courthouse in downtown Boston was a fortress of granite and marble that had witnessed countless moments of justice, but few as comprehensively devastating as the case of United States versus Nathaniel Ashford. 6 months after his arrest, the man who'd once commanded respect in Boston's business circles sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hair unkempt, his face gaunt from the stress of pretrial detention and the growing realization that his entire adult life had been built on lies. The prosecution had assembled a case so airtight that even Nathaniel's court-appointed attorney, a weary public defender named Thomas Chen who'd drawn the short straw, had recommended pleading guilty to all charges. The evidence was overwhelming. Fraudulent tax returns claiming fictitious business income, conspiracy to defraud the federal government, wire fraud across state lines, and terroristic threats against minor children. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the federal sentencing guidelines showed no mercy for white-collar criminals who exploited family relationships. Judge Sarah Harrison, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the federal bench, had reviewed every piece of evidence the prosecution intended to present. The video recordings of Nathaniel's supervised visitation, where he'd called his own daughters financial leverage and liabilities. Audio recordings from his dinner with Amelia, where he'd outlined his plans to use the children as bargaining chips. Financial documents proving he'd knowingly filed false tax returns for 6 consecutive years. Testimony from Scarlett Davidson detailing his explicit statements about exploiting federal court connections through romantic manipulation. Mr. Ashford, Judge Harrison said as the sentencing hearing began, I've presided over this court for 3 decades, and I can honestly say I've never seen a case that combines such extensive financial fraud with such callous disregard for child welfare. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything to say on your own behalf? Nathaniel's attorney had coached him to express remorse, to acknowledge his mistakes, to throw himself on the mercy of the court. But sitting in that courtroom, facing the complete destruction of everything he'd built, Nathaniel couldn't bring himself to accept responsibility for what felt like an elaborate trap. Your Honor, he said, rising unsteadily, I was the victim of a systematic campaign of manipulation by one of the wealthiest families in America. Everything I did was in response to their interference in my life, their control over my finances, their orchestrated destruction of my marriage and my business. Judge Harrison's expression didn't change, but the courtroom gallery, filled with reporters, former business associates, and curious observers, murmured with disbelief. Even facing decades in prison, Nathaniel was still blaming others for his choices. The Winters family spent years setting me up, he continued, his voice growing louder with each word. They created fake business opportunities to monitor my activities. They manipulated my income to control my behavior. They recorded private conversations and used my own children as weapons against me. I'm not the criminal here. I'm the victim of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of Boston's business and political establishment. Judge Harrison allowed him to finish, then consulted her notes with the patience of someone who'd heard every possible justification for criminal behavior. Mr. Ashford, I've reviewed the evidence extensively, and I want to make something clear. The Winters family's financial support of your lifestyle doesn't excuse your decision to file fraudulent tax returns. Their monitoring of your behavior doesn't justify your threats against infant children. Their wealth doesn't give you the right to commit federal crimes. She leaned forward, her voice taking on a harder edge. What's particularly disturbing about your case is your complete inability to accept responsibility for your actions. Even now, facing overwhelming evidence of your guilt, you're blaming the very people who supported you financially for 6 years while you systematically lied about your income and threatened to exploit their grandchildren. In the gallery, Amelia sat with Margaret Thorne and her father, holding Grace while Hope slept peacefully in her carrier. She'd chosen to attend the sentencing not out of vindictiveness, but because she wanted to witness the final chapter of a nightmare that had consumed years of her life. The twins were now 8 months old, healthy and thriving, completely unaware that their biological father was about to disappear from their lives permanently. The evidence shows that you married Ms. Winters under false pretenses, Judge Harrison continued, presenting yourself as a successful businessman when you were actually facing bankruptcy and criminal charges from previous employment. You accepted financial support from her family while planning to abandon her and exploit your children for custody leverage. When your deception was exposed, you responded with threats and violence rather than honesty or remorse. She opened the sentencing guidelines and reviewed her calculations one final time. For the charge of conspiracy to commit federal tax fraud, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison. For wire fraud, an additional 10 years, to be served consecutively. For making terroristic threats against minor children, 5 years, also consecutive. Total sentence, 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted. Nathaniel's legs buckled, and his attorney had to physically support him to prevent a complete collapse. 30 years meant he'd be nearly 70 when released, if he survived federal prison at all. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued over the commotion, you are permanently prohibited from any contact with the victims in this case, including your former wife and daughters. Any attempt to communicate with them, directly or through intermediates, will result in additional federal charges. Upon your eventual release, you will serve 10 years of supervised probation and pay full restitution of $7 million to the Winters family for the funds you fraudulently claimed as income. As federal marshals moved to escort Nathaniel from the courtroom, he turned toward where Amelia was sitting, his face contorted with rage and desperation. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "I'll appeal this. I'll expose what you people really are." But his threats were hollow, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. His appeals would fail because his guilt was indisputable. His attempts to expose the Winters family would find no audience because their business practices were completely legal. His dreams of eventual revenge would fade in the harsh reality of federal prison, where white-collar criminals who threatened children were not treated kindly by other inmates. As the marshals led him away, Amelia felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only a profound sadness for what could have been if Nathaniel had chosen to be honest, to be grateful for the support he'd received, to love his children instead of seeing them as leverage. She'd given him 6 years of her life, believing he was someone worth loving. In return, he'd given her lies, manipulation, and ultimately the gift of understanding exactly what kind of person she'd married. Margaret leaned over as the courtroom began to empty. "It's over, Amelia. Truly over. He'll never be able to hurt you or the girls again." Jonathan stood behind them, watching as the last remnants of his investigation concluded. 30 years is appropriate, he said quietly. It sends a message that threatening children, especially your own children, has consequences that go far beyond civil court. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Amelia looked at her daughters one last time. Grace was awake now, her bright eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with curiosity rather than fear. Hope slept peacefully, her tiny hand curled around Amelia's finger. They would grow up without their biological father, but they would never lack for love, security, or protection. They would know their grandfather as a man of integrity who'd fought to keep them safe. They would understand that strength came not from manipulation or threats, but from patience, preparation, and unwavering principle. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and questions, but Amelia had only one statement. "Justice was served today, not just for my family, but for every woman who's ever been told she's powerless. My daughters will grow up knowing that dignity and truth are more powerful than threats and deception." The man who'd thrown her into the December cold was gone forever, and spring had finally arrived. 2 years after Nathaniel's sentencing, Amelia stood in the conference room of the newly established Winters Foundation for Family Justice, watching as her team prepared for their most ambitious project yet. The foundation, funded by a significant portion of her inheritance, had become a beacon of hope for women and children escaping abusive relationships. What had begun as her personal quest for justice had evolved into a comprehensive support system that combined legal advocacy, financial assistance, and emotional counseling for families facing manipulation and exploitation. The twins, now 2.5 years old, played quietly in the foundation's on-site childcare center while their mother worked. Grace had inherited her grandfather's analytical mind and could often be found attempting to organize the other children's toys according to mysterious criteria only she understood. Hope had developed into a natural peacemaker, somehow always knowing when another child needed comfort or when tensions were rising in the playroom. Neither girl remembered their biological father, and Amelia had made the deliberate choice not to burden them with that history until they were old enough to understand it properly. For now, they knew Jonathan as Grandpa, Margaret as Aunt Maggie, and the foundation staff as an extended family that loved and protected them unconditionally. The Massachusetts legislature passed the Winters Act yesterday, Margaret announced as she entered the conference room carrying a stack of legal documents. Full legal protections for children used as leverage in custody disputes, mandatory psychological evaluations for parents who make financial threats regarding their children, and immediate termination of parental rights for anyone convicted of exploitation or abuse. The legislation had been Margaret's passion project for the past 18 months, working with state lawmakers to create legal frameworks that would prevent other families from enduring what Amelia had experienced. The law was comprehensive, covering everything from emergency custody modifications to financial disclosure requirements for parents with suspicious income sources. How many families will this affect? Amelia asked, reviewing the final language of the bill. Potentially thousands, Margaret replied. But more importantly, it creates legal precedents that other states can follow. We've already received inquiries from legislators in New York, California, and Florida who want to implement similar protections. Dr. Patricia Mills, who'd left her position at Mass General to become the Foundation's clinical director, joined the conversation from her office overlooking Boston Harbor. Over the past 2 years, she developed innovative therapy protocols specifically designed for women recovering from systematic emotional manipulation, and her research was being implemented at domestic violence centers across the country. We've had some remarkable success stories, Dr. Mills reported. Sarah Chen, remember her? The woman whose husband was using their son to extort money from her parents? She completed her law degree last month and just accepted a position with the district attorney's office specializing in family exploitation cases. Amelia smiled, remembering Sarah's arrival at the Foundation 18 months earlier. Terrified, isolated, convinced she was powerless against her husband's legal maneuvering. Now she was helping prosecute similar cases, using her experience to identify manipulation tactics that might escape less experienced attorneys. What about the Morrison family? Amelia asked, referring to a case they'd taken on 6 months earlier involving a father who'd disappeared with his children after losing a custody battle. Found them in Colorado, Margaret said with satisfaction. Local authorities arrested him yesterday on kidnapping charges, and the children are being reunited with their mother this afternoon. The Foundation's investigative resources made the difference. Law enforcement doesn't have the funding to pursue these cases across state lines, but we do. This was the reality of the Foundation's work. Cases that law enforcement couldn't prioritize, families who couldn't afford comprehensive legal representation, children caught in the crossfire of adults who saw them as property rather than people. The Winters Foundation filled those gaps with unlimited resources, expert staff, and the kind of strategic thinking that had originally protected Amelia and her daughters. Jonathan entered the conference room carrying Grace, who'd apparently decided that afternoon meetings were more interesting than story time. Senator Williams called, he announced. The federal version of the Winters Act has bipartisan support in both houses. It should pass before the end of the session. Federal legislation would create nationwide protections, closing loopholes that allowed manipulative parents to forum shop for sympathetic jurisdictions or exploit interstate custody complications. It would also establish federal funding for family justice foundations in every state, ensuring that Amelia's model could be replicated regardless of local wealth or political support. There's something else, Jonathan continued, his expression growing serious. I received a call from the federal prison where Nathaniel is serving his sentence. He's been making requests to speak with reporters, claiming he has information about corruption in the Massachusetts family court system. Amelia felt a familiar chill. Even locked away for decades, Nathaniel was still trying to manipulate the narrative, still searching for ways to portray himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Let him talk, Margaret said dismissively. We documented everything. Every transaction was legal, every surveillance activity was properly authorized, every piece of evidence was obtained through legitimate means. He can make all the accusations he wants, they'll only reinforce his image as a delusional criminal who refuses to accept responsibility for his actions. More importantly, Dr. Mills added, his attempts to continue manipulating public opinion from prison will provide excellent case study material for our research on persistent predatory behavior. We're always looking for examples of how manipulation tactics evolve when traditional power structures are removed. As the meeting concluded and staff members returned to their respective responsibilities, Amelia found herself alone in her office with the twins. Grace had fallen asleep in her grandfather's arms, exhausted by her afternoon adventure, while Hope played quietly with blocks that spelled out words she couldn't yet read but seemed to understand instinctively. The view from her office windows showed Boston Harbor, where Winter's global ships continued their worldwide operations, generating the wealth that funded the Foundation's work. But it also showed the city beyond, neighborhoods where other families were fighting battles similar to the one she'd won, where other children needed protection from parents who saw them as leverage rather than gifts. Her phone buzzed with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Winters, my name is Elena Rodriguez. My ex-husband is threatening to take my daughter unless I sign over my inheritance. I saw your interview on Channel 5, and I was hoping, could the Foundation help me?" Amelia smiled and immediately forwarded the message to Margaret's team. Another family to protect, another child to shield from manipulation, another victory in a war that would continue long after her own battle had ended. The twins would grow up in a world where their mother's experience had created new protections for vulnerable families. They would understand that true strength came not from dominating others, but from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. They would know that their grandfather's wealth carried responsibilities as well as privileges, and that their family's legacy was measured not in dollars accumulated but in lives saved. As evening settled over Boston, Amelia gathered her daughters and prepared to head home to the Beacon Hill mansion, the same house where Nathaniel had thrown her out into the December cold, now restored as a sanctuary where love and security replaced manipulation and fear. The rooms that had once echoed with arguments now filled with laughter. The kitchen where she'd prepared countless meals for a man who never appreciated her efforts now hosted tea parties and birthday celebrations. The nursery where she'd rocked the twins while fighting postpartum depression and isolation now served as a playroom for children who would never doubt their worth or their mother's love. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the first significant snowfall since that terrible night 2.5 years ago. But this time, Amelia watched it from behind warm windows, surrounded by her daughters and secure in the knowledge that no one would ever again have the power to make her feel small, worthless, or powerless. She'd been thrown away like garbage, but she'd risen like a phoenix, transforming her pain into purpose and her survival into a legacy that would protect countless other families for generations to come. The war was over, and dignity had triumphed completely. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.